I'm Chloe Harris. I'm 32 years old, and right now I'm staring at that little succulent on my front porch like it's the only thing in the world that still makes sense. I live in a tiny two-bedroom cottage just outside Chicago, and I bought it with my own paycheck, every penny earned as a financial analyst at Capwave. That succulent, a jade green rosette of fleshy leaves edged in purple, sits in a white ceramic pot that I rescued from a thrift shop, the word grow engraved faintly on its side. I water it every morning and talk to it like an old friend. You and we've both been through some rough seasons, but we're still here, right? The sun filters through the kitchen window and catches its glossy leaves, and for a second I feel almost peaceful. Almost. This place is supposed to be my sanctuary, the one physical space in my life that's entirely mine. The moment I inherited a modest nest egg from my grandmother, she was the only one in my family who truly saw me. I snatched up the chance to escape. My parents had spent every cent on my sister Emma's influencer dream, fancy dorm rooms, photo-ready apartments, sponsored trips to Bali. Meanwhile, I handled my college expenses by working late nights at a bookstore, brown bagging peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, acquiring textbooks used or borrowed, scrimping, so I could send exactly $400 each month to help with the mortgage. "You're different. You're independent," Mom told me once. "You'll figure it out." And I did. But independence has its price. Within days of closing on this cottage, my phone blew up with group texts from my parents and Emma sharing house listings that looked like mini mansions, 5 bedrooms, sparkling pool, triple car garage, perfect for you. They all chirped as if I'd asked for it. I stopped replying. Then the calls began. First, Mom fussing, "Honey, why didn't you tell us? We have so many ideas." Then Emma, "Sis, we can't wait to move in when the kids visit." And finally, when I tried to brush them off, a passive-aggressive post on Facebook. A picture of their cramped living room. Emma's 3 children squished on a couch, captioned, "We just need a little more space, don't you think?" I felt a flicker of anger and something stronger. A fierce resolve I hadn't recognized in myself until that moment. I blocked their numbers. I muted their threads. I went dark online and doubled down at work. I clung to my succulent like a lifeline. It reminded me every day growth happens drop by drop, but my victory felt fragile, like a thin veneer over nervous energy. I still expected them to turn up at my door demanding their way. And of course, one evening, I heard the jingle of the doorbell, and there they were. Emma standing there with the spare key my mom had sneakily left in a flower pot, her toddlers in tow, smacking peanut butter crackers on my welcome mat. "We came to see your new place," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. Mom said it'd be fine. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I took a step back. "What are you doing here?" I barked more sharply than I intended. Emma's kids looked up at me with wide eyes. She simply smiled, tilting her head. "We're family, Chloe. You should have told us about the spare key." In that instant, I felt the world shift. They weren't visitors. They were occupiers. My gaze snagged on the succulent by the front door. One of Emma's children, a chubby little boy named Mason, reached out and yanked one of its leaves. It snapped off in his fist, soil sprinkling across the flagstones. I swear I heard that leaf cry. That's when I did something I never thought I would. I hit 911 on my phone, thumb shaking so badly I dropped it twice. "Hi," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I live at 1426 Elmwood Drive. My sister and her children have broken in and refuse to leave." The dispatcher's calm questions filled the space around me in stark contrast to the chaos unfolding inside my once peaceful cottage. Emma's lip curled, her face transforming from saccharine to scornful. "You're calling the cops on your own family," she snarled. "Yes," I said, meeting her gaze head-on, "because this is my home." And just like that, I crossed a line I had thought untouchable. I was terrified, terrified of the judgment, terrified of the path I'd opened, terrified of revealing how much I'd been hurt. But a part of me, the part that whispered to the succulent each morning, felt electrified. I realized then that risk was the only way to claim my own life. As I stood on the porch waiting for the police, the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows over Elmwood Drive. The officers arrived, two burly women with no-nonsense expressions. They peered at Emma and the kids, then at me, and nodded. In minutes, Emma and her brood were out the door, her Instagram-perfect facade slipping into sulky defeat. I watched from my doorway, hands trembling as they got into their SUV and sped away. I half expected my mother to swoop in next, a peace offering pie in hand, but the street remained silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Inside, I cradled the broken succulent leaf in my palm. Backlit by the porch light, it looked delicate yet still strangely beautiful, like proof that even when life snapped you in two, you could still hold the pieces. I knelt down on the cold flagstone and pressed the leaf into my hand. A fresh wave of tears came, but they weren't tears of fear this time. They were tears of release. I whispered to it, "We'll start over. We'll grow back stronger." I went to bed that night feeling both relieved and exposed, as if I'd bared my soul in public and there was no going back. I barely slept. In the small hours, I lay awake listening for any sign of the phone, lighting up blocked messages, voicemails, begging forgiveness, or worse, a new threat. Dawn crept through my curtains, and I moved to the porch again. The succulent was intact, its remaining leaves glistening with dew. It was still standing. And that's when I knew I wasn't just defending a house, I was defending every moment I'd sacrificed to get here and every moment to come. But I also knew the battle was only beginning. My parents would come, or my aunt might, or my neighbors might gossip. Social media would turn my clear-cut stand into a viral drama. And worst of all, Emma might return steely-eyed and insistent to try a different tactic. I took a deep breath, feeling both exhilarated and exhausted. I carried that sprig of broken succulent inside, placed it gently in a glass of water, and decided I wouldn't let this uproar uproot me. I would fight for my right to simply exist on my own terms. But first, I had to figure out how to turn that single broken leaf into the start of something new. Because in the end, healing isn't a lightning bolt moment. It's a series of tiny choices, like watering a plant every morning, whispering encouragement, and refusing to let it wither. And as the sun rose higher, I realized the question wasn't whether I would stand up for myself, it was how fiercely I would do it. I still don't know what comes next. Maybe Emma will call the lawyer my friend Marcus recommended. Maybe my mother will post another guilt-ridden note on Facebook. Maybe someone will hack my security camera feed. But right now, in this quiet clutter of my cottage, surrounded by half-packed moving boxes and that broken leaf floating in water, I feel something I haven't felt in years: unshakable resolve. Tomorrow I'll start by changing the locks. But tonight, I let myself believe that for the first time, I'm not alone. Because every petal on that succulent is a testament to survival, and every broken shard is an invitation to regrow. And if my family thought they could shove me back into the shadows, they haven't met my stubborn little plant. And they haven't met me. The question is, will they push me far enough that I shatter? Or will I prove leaf by leaf that sometimes the smallest things have the deepest roots? And as the morning light washes over the porch, I dare to hope it's the latter. But that's just the start of the story. I woke up the morning after the police visit feeling like I'd been through a war. My hands still shook as I reached over to the nightstand where I'd left my phone and a half-empty glass of water. The little succulent sat on the windowsill, its leaves glistening with condensation from the humidifier I'd turned on in the night. I ran my fingertip along one leaf, feeling its firmness, proof that life goes on even when everything else feels shaky. I threw on jeans and a t-shirt, bypassed coffee for sparkling water, and reminded myself today I keep moving forward. I headed to Marcus Nguyen's office, tucked above a bakery 2 blocks from my cottage. Marcus, a soft-spoken guy with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for never losing a case, greeted me with a nod. He poured us both coffee and slid a thick envelope across the desk. Inside were the cease and desist letters he'd drafted, one to my mother, one to Emma, and one to Josh. I signed each page with a steady hand, though my heart pounded like a drumbeat in my chest. "This should buy you some breathing room," Marcus said quietly, tapping the envelope. "But be prepared, they might challenge it. Your family has resources, and they'll use whatever leverage they've got." I nodded, swallowing hard. The risk of a nasty countersuit loomed, but so did the risk of letting them trample me again. Next, I made my way to Nora Patel's apartment. Nora, my friend from college, now working in public relations, lived in a sleek loft downtown. She'd been my sounding board ever since the first post went viral. "Sister calls cops on family cottage gate ensues. Over coconut water and avocado toast, we talked strategy." "You need to frame this as a story of empowerment," Nora insisted, her eyes bright behind her laptop screen. "People love a David versus Goliath narrative, especially one where the underdog builds her own life. We pitch you as the hardworking analyst who just wants a little peace." She drafted an outline for a Medium post and a tweet storm script that emphasized my love for independence and fairness. I studied my reflection in the window, someone strong, someone who deserved this cottage and this life. Back home, I found a stack of voicemail notifications: Mom, Dad, my aunt, even Lisa from work. I left them all unread. I needed to focus on the present, a day of heavy lifting and house chores. I hauled boxes from the guest room, Mom's art studio, I'd jokingly labeled it, into the living room and dusted off picture frames. As I scrubbed the kitchen counters, my fingertip knocked the succulent pot, sending it wobbling. I lunged to catch it, heart in my throat. The pot righted itself, but a few droplets of water sloshed onto the hardwood floor. I crouched down and gently wiped the water, murmuring, "We're still standing, little one." That afternoon, I got a notice slid under the front door in a crisp white envelope stamped "HOA violation, 1426 Elmwood Drive." My pulse jumped. I tore it open, a complaint against unauthorized exterior installations, namely my vintage wooden bench and my succulent display. The letter demanded I remove all non-compliant fixtures by the end of the week or face fines up to $500 per day. The HOA president, Linda Carter, cited the community guidelines: all planters must be terracotta or neutral stone, not thrift shop ceramics. The tone was polite but firm. I reread the letter, incredulous. It felt too convenient, like someone had whispered a complaint in Linda's ear. I dialed Linda's number, my phone pressed to my ear. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and professional. "Chloe Harris, I presume I received your call. How can I help?" I asked if she knew who filed the complaint. She hemmed and hawed, then said she couldn't share member information. I told her the regulation seemed arbitrary for a succulent, that these particular guidelines had never been enforced before. She sighed and said enforcement was a community matter. "We have to treat everyone equally," she said. But her tone faltered when I asked if any other houses had received notices. "Not that I'm aware of," she admitted. I thanked her and hung up, my blood boiling. I sank onto the porch steps, tucking my feet beneath me and cradling the violation notice in my lap. Sunlight warmed my shoulders, but the heat felt oppressive, like the pressure building inside me. The succulent seemed to glare at me, its leaves too glossy, too defiant. I pictured Emma and my parents giggling over this next helpful squeeze, Mom lobbying Linda behind my back, Emma exploiting HOA rules like another power play. A fresh wave of anger swelled. If they wanted to weaponize rules and bylaws, they'd unleashed something stronger than they'd bargained for. I messaged Marcus HOA violation succulent pot bench Linda Carter. Advice. He replied almost instantly. Review HOA covenants. Consider calling a special meeting to petition waiver for your specific planters. If Linda's biased, you could subpoena meeting minutes. I closed my eyes and pictured my grandmother's face, how proud she'd have been that I stood up for myself. I resolved to fight this not just for me and the succulent, but for the principle of owning my choices. That evening, a LinkedIn notification pinged Jordan Lee, arts and culture reporter at the Chicago Tribune, wanted to interview me. She'd seen Nora's pitch and wanted my side of the story for a feature on suburban life in the social media age. My heart fluttered. This could be big or disastrous. I messaged Nora. "Are we ready to go public?" She replied, "Yes. Clean narrative financial analyst buys tiny cottage stands up to entitled family and small town bureaucracy. It's perfect." I hesitated, staring at the succulent as it caught the last rays of sunset. In my mind, I heard my grandmother's voice, "Tell the truth, but protect your heart." The next morning, I met Jordan in a cozy cafe near my house. I held a latte and told her why I'd bought the cottage, how I'd saved every dime, what it meant to me to finally have a safe space. I described the broken leaf, the 911 call, the violation notice, the texts that flooded my phone. Jordan's pen scratched across her notepad, her eyes sympathetic. "This is about more than a plant," she said. "It's about claiming your own life." She snapped a few photos of me by the window, the succulent in the background. I felt exposed, but also powerful, like my story might encourage someone else to stand up for themselves. By the time I set foot back on Elmwood Drive, a draft of her article was already circulating among her editors, complete with my quotes and photos. I braced myself for reactions, supportive comments, trolling, heartfelt stories from strangers. I unlocked my door, walked past my living room bench, and approached the succulent. One of the inner leaves had a tiny brown spot, stress damage, I realized. I breathed deeply and clipped it with sanitized scissors, dropping it into a glass jar of water. "We keep going," I whispered. But the next blow arrived that night, a group text from my parents that wasn't blocked. Mom's name popped up in blue, then Dad's. My chest tightened. Reluctantly, I peeked. The text read, "Emily is upset. She says you're making her kids sick by not letting them stay. Can we talk tomorrow?" I stared at the message until the screen blurred. I wanted to scream that I wouldn't relent, that my home wasn't a playground for their convenience. Yet a small part of me felt the familiar tug of guilt. I shook it off. "No," I whispered to myself. "Not this time." I set my phone on the counter and poured a glass of wine. The succulent sat in its pot, backlit by the lamp. Against all odds, it still reached upward as if saying, "You're not alone." I contemplated the next step. A hearing, subpoena minutes, court date, media coverage, so many variables and more risks than I'd ever anticipated. But I also felt something fierce curdle in my veins. Conviction. They could post petition protest. They could try to strip me of every ounce of autonomy, but they could not snuff out my resolve. I finished my wine and carried a tray out to the porch where the air was cooler. I perched on the steps and cradled the tray, my eyes drifting to the now repotted succulent leaf in the glass jar beside the bench. It bobbed lightly in the water, ready to root. "Tomorrow," I said aloud, "we start fresh." And deep down, I knew that fresh starts were never easy, but neither were fake apologies or entitlement masquerading as concern. Tomorrow, I'd show up at that HOA meeting, live stream it, and make sure my story couldn't be rewritten by anyone else. As the night settled, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease just a fraction. I reached out, touched one of the jade green leaves, and smiled. "Let's see what you've got," I murmured. The world outside Elmwood Drive felt bigger, louder, and somehow more mine than ever before. Tomorrow's sun would bring new challenges, but also new chances to grow. And isn't that what we all want? A chance to flourish on our own terms. I closed my eyes, sensing the start of a storm, but knowing storms churn the air for clearer skies. I drifted off with the succulent's silhouette dancing in my mind, ready for whatever tomorrow held. I woke at dawn the next morning with a knot in my stomach so tight I could barely breathe. Today was the day of the HOA hearing, my first public showdown, and the stakes felt enormous. I dressed slowly, choosing a navy blazer over a simple white blouse and dark jeans, trying to balance professional polish with the gritty honesty of someone who'd lived paycheck to paycheck just months ago. I tucked a single jade green leaf from my broken succulent into my lapel pocket, a quiet talisman reminding me that even damaged things can root themselves anew. When I stepped onto Elmwood Drive, the neighborhood looked deceptively calm. Flower beds were manicured driveways swept, and every lawn boasted identical Welcome to Elmwood Estate signs. I could feel the eyes on me as I made my way to the community clubhouse, a low brick building with a glass entryway. Ahead of me, neighbors clustered in small groups, whispering behind polite smiles. A woman in a crisp cardigan nodded at me, but her eyes flicked instantly to the white envelope in my hands, the one stamped Notice of Special Hearing. Inside the meeting room was set up like a courtroom. A long table at the front held nameplates for the HOA board members. President Linda Carter, Secretary Robert Klein, Treasurer Anita Shaw, while rows of folding chairs faced them, almost all occupied. I spotted Emma in the back row, flanked by Mom and Dad. Emma waved at me, her smile wide, but her eyes were hard. I sank into a seat near the aisle, heart pounding so fiercely I thought someone might hear it. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Linda Carter tapped her gavel and called the meeting to order. She droned on through a few routine items: landscaping contracts, pool maintenance schedules, holiday lighting rules. Then she cleared her throat. Item 6, violation complaint against Ms. Chloe Harris for unauthorized exterior fixtures. She turned and looked directly at me. Ms. Harris, would you like to make an opening statement? I stood, smoothing my blazer and pulling the succulent leaf from my pocket. I laid it on the table and said, "Thank you, Ms. Carter and board members. My name is Chloe Harris, and I bought 1426 Elmwood Drive with my own savings because I believe in owning my life." The items flagged in the violation notice, a vintage wooden bench, and my ceramic planter with its succulent, are personal choices that contribute to the character of this community, not detract from it. I'd like to request a waiver that allows me to keep these fixtures given their significance to me and the fact that they predate any complaints. A murmur rippled through the room. Emma stood and announced, "I second that, just kidding." A half-laugh, half-sneer that caught the nervous chuckles of a few other residents. I clenched my fists under the table. The board members exchanged glances. Anita Shaw peered at the succulent leaf, then at me. "Ms. Harris, the covenant states that planters must adhere to a specific material palette. Ceramics are not on the approved list." I nodded. "I understand that, but enforcement has been inconsistent. On my block numbers, 1402, 1410, and 1434, all display ceramic planters similar to mine." I felt a surge of adrenaline, the strategy Marcus and I had discussed. I clicked on my phone's notes and recited addresses even as my pulse pounded in my ears. Furthermore, I petitioned last month for community input on updating the guidelines to reflect diverse aesthetic choices. No one objected until now. Linda cleared her throat. "No formal petition was filed, Ms. Harris, and as president, I must uphold our current regulations." Her voice was polite but final. Then she surprised me. "However, the board will vote on a one-time exception for your planter, provided you replace the bench with an approved model by the end of the month." A collective exhale swept the room. Relief sagged through me, but I caught Emma's eye, her lips pressed in a thin line. Mom clapped softly. Dad's shoulders relaxed. I realized then that even a small concession could be spun as a victory for them, as evidence they'd helped me. My stomach twisted. Just as I thought the crisis was over, Linda added, "Also, we received a second complaint today about the bench obstructing foot traffic on the sidewalk." My heart seized. No way someone had filed another complaint in the 2 hours since I arrived. I swallowed, glancing at the complaint sheet. The name scrawled at the bottom wasn't mine or one of my neighbors, it was Emma Davis. I rose again. "Board members, I want to be clear, this is harassment, not community governance. I'm happy to replace the bench, but I won't stand for my family weaponizing HOA rules to push me out." The room went silent. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Emma stood, her voice sharp. You're overreacting. I filed a complaint because your bench intrudes on my kid's play area. You're being selfish again, Chloe. My chest tightened. I felt anger, humiliation, but also an iron resolve. I looked at the board. If complaints are based on personal vendettas, I'd like those to be invalidated. I request evidence of official neighborhood objections, not family grievances. Then I added quietly, I'm prepared to take this to small claims court if necessary. Everyone gasped. Linda scribbled notes. Robert Klein adjusted his glasses and said, We'll take your request under advisement and reconvene next week. With that, she pounded the gavel. The meeting was adjourned. My legs felt like jelly as I gathered my things. Emma stormed out without a word. Mom lingered, placing a hand on my arm. Sweetheart, we just wanted you to be part of the family, she began, but I shook her off gently. I'm part of my own life, I told her, voice steadier than I expected. I'll see you at the next meeting. And I walked out before she could respond. Outside, I sank onto the front steps, took the succulent leaf in my hand and pressed it to my lips. It was brittle at the tip, but still alive. I whispered, You and me will go all the way. As I left Elmwood Drive, I realized something profound. Winning the planter waiver would be a small victory, but exposing the vendetta would be the real triumph. I was ready for whatever came next, another complaint, another lawsuit, another smear campaign. They could try to drown me in bylaws and gossip, but I had roots now deep enough to anchor me through the fiercest storm. That night, I laid out my strategy in 3 columns on my kitchen table: legal, media, personal. Under legal, I listed subpoena meeting minutes, review petition procedures, consult Marcus on countersuit. Under media, I noted follow-up with Jordan at the Tribune social media posts, share HOA documents publicly. Under personal, I wrote protect mental health meditation therapy evening walks. I stared at the board, feeling a surge of clarity. The phone buzzed, an email notification, urgent HOA reconvening special session Thursday at 7 p.m. My heart skipped. That was only 2 days away. They wanted to finalize their decision before I could gather evidence. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, recalling the drips of water that I gave my succulent each morning. Each drip felt small, almost insignificant, but together they made a difference. I pulled out my laptop and drafted a firm but calm request to Linda Carter. Given the surprising new complaint, I request clarity on hearing procedures and rights to evidence submission. I look forward to a fair process. I hit send. The next morning, I woke to an avalanche of notifications. Dozens of neighbors had shared Jordan's Tribune draft, commending my stand. Comments poured in. Go, Chloe, protect your right to decorate family drama spilled all over HOA Rules Classic. My heart soared with unexpected warmth. But nestled among the supportive messages was a DM from my coworker, Lisa. Hey, saw your story. Are you okay? Everyone at the office is talking, just checking in. My chest tightened again. Did I want my professional life to spiral into gossip? I knew the risk my reputation, my career, everything I'd built at Cap Wave could be on the line. If the wrong headline landed on the front page, I'd be that crazy sister or entitled homeowner. I closed the DM without responding. Then I sent a quick text to Nora. Media is blowing up. Is there a way to guard my privacy? She replied almost instantly. We'll set strict parameters for interviews. No off-the-record chatter. Tighten your online profiles. I exhaled. The storm was gathering force from every direction, HOA family media office rumors. But I felt oddly calm, as if the raw edge of fear had numbed into resolve. I set my alarm for an early yoga class, determined to keep my mind centered. Then I stood at the kitchen sink, watching the succulent leaf quiver in its water glass. Its roots, translucent and delicate, were already forming proof that even a broken fragment could anchor itself, find nourishment, and thrive. I whispered to it, You grow, and I'll grow. We'll show them what resilience looks like. The sun dipped low that evening, painting the sky pink, as I locked up the house and walked to a local community center for a late yoga session. My phone stayed in my bag the whole time, silent and still. For an hour, I moved through poses, feeling tension melt out of my shoulders as I centered my breath and my mind. When I left the studio, twilight had settled over Chicago's skyline. I paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the city lights. Tomorrow, I'd return to that clubhouse for the special session. Tomorrow, I'd watch Linda Carter's face when I presented her with documents of procedural misconduct. Tomorrow, the neighbors would see who really cared about community guidelines and who was simply wielding power to punish. I raised my face to the night breeze, tasting hope and fear and the thrill of standing up for myself. I knew I was taking risks: public humiliation, legal fees, family backlash, but I also knew I was doing something that mattered. I had staked a claim to my own life, and I wasn't about to surrender it. As I walked home, I drafted in my head the opening lines of my next message to the HOA board: "Good evening, members of Elmwood Estates. In preparation for tomorrow's session, please find attached minutes from last month's meeting indicating zero record of any planter violation discussions." My steps were sure, my mind sharp. The world might try to bend me, but I was learning to bend right back. And when I unlocked my door and flicked on the porch light, I saw my little succulent pot waiting for me, no longer just a plant, but a living emblem of every drop of perseverance, every choice made in courage, every boundary drawn in the sand. I picked up the pot, turned it to face the street, and whispered, "Let them see us." Tomorrow, I'd show them exactly who I was and exactly what it meant to grow on your own terms. I slipped out of bed before sunrise, mind already racing through the day's agenda as I reached for the glass jar cradling my succulent cutting. Its slender roots had doubled overnight, snaking through the water like tiny white ribbons, proof that resilience could sprout from the most fragile break. I smiled at it, tucked it carefully into the canvas tote slung over my shoulder alongside my binder of HOA documents, and stepped into the chill morning air. I paused on the porch, inhaling the scent of dew-soaked grass and concrete braced for confrontation. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a statement of who I was and what I would no longer tolerate. The clubhouse parking lot was halfway full when I arrived, neighbors filing in with coffee cups and polite nods. I set my tote down on the podium table before the board's dais, gently arranging the succulent cutting in its jar so it faced the audience, a living exhibit of my personal stake in this fight. As people took seats, I overheard murmurs. "She really brought a plant. Is that the infamous succulent?" The whispers stung at first, but I let them roll off me. This little cutting represented every drop of courage I'd poured into this battle. When the clock ticked to 7:00 p.m., President Linda Carter rapped her gavel and the room fell silent. I watched her for a moment, her posture, stiff eyes flicking to the jar, and then I took a deep breath and stood. "Good evening," I began, voice steady though my heart thundered. "Thank you for allowing me this time. I'm Chloe Harris, homeowner at 1426 Elmwood Drive." I gestured to the succulent cutting. "This plant is a fragment of the original I care for on my porch. It broke during an incident of trespass my sister's family did not have my permission to enter. This cutting represents broken trust, but also the possibility of new growth." A few heads tilted, as if digesting my metaphor. I continued, without pause. "Tonight, I request two things. First, formal recognition that personal property violations like the unfounded bench obstruction complaint are not community governance but family interference. Second, a clear pathway to codify exceptions for existing exterior personalizations that add unique character to our neighborhood." I clicked to the next slide on my tablet, photos of my bench, the intact planter neighbors at numbers 1402 and 1434 displaying identical ceramics. The screen glowed with evidence of inconsistent enforcement. At that moment, Robert Klein, the board secretary, cleared his throat. "Ms. Harris, while your documentation is thorough, the covenants are clear. Exceptions are granted only by written petition signed by at least 1/3 of homeowners." I nodded, having anticipated this. Understood. I've circulated a digital petition and gathered signatures from 20% so far. I also have verbal support from several neighbors here tonight. I called on 3 allies, fellow homeowners who raised their hands, validated my petition, and one older gentleman muttered, "Good on you, kid." A ripple of supportive murmurs swept the room. I felt the tide shift slightly in my favor, but I knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Then Linda Carter sat forward, her expression polite but guarded. "This is a special session," she said. "The board will consider your petition and the complaints. We'll deliberate and reconvene in 2 weeks." She tapped her gavel. Meeting adjourned. I exhaled the first release of breath I'd allowed myself all evening. I collected my binder, lifted the succulent cutting, and smiled at the board. "Thank you," I said, though I knew the real work was just beginning. As people filed out, I noticed Emma in the corner, arms crossed, lips pressed together. Mom hovered nearby, offering me consolatory eyes. I met their gazes and nodded politely, refusing to let them see my relief or my exhaustion. Back in the night air, I loaded my tote and sat in my car for a long minute. My phone buzzed a notification from Jordan Lee. Her Tribune article had gone live, headlined, "Chicago Homeowner versus HOA, the Succulent Stand." I tapped the link and scrolled through quotes from neighbors. Chloe's courage inspired me. Rules are rules, but empathy matters. Finally, someone who knows what it takes to build a life from scratch. A lump formed in my throat as I realized my story had taken on a life of its own. Social media was lighting up with hashtags like #succulent solidarity and defend the bench. I closed the browser, aware that virality was a double-edged sword. Support could bring pressure, and pressure could shatter patience. That night, I laid out a battleground map on my kitchen counter: legal motion deadlines, petition, signature goals, media interview schedules. Beside it, the succulent cutting glowed faintly under the countertop lamp. I traced its roots with my fingertip, so small, so delicate, yet determined to grow. I realized that every choice I made would echo in those tender roots. I resolved to protect them as fiercely as I protected myself. My phone chimed again. A message from Marcus HOA just sent a response. They're requesting all petition signatures by Monday, no exceptions. My stomach lurched. That was 3 days away. I'd only collected signatures from half the 1/3 threshold. I stared at the succulent and whispered, "You'll have to hold on tighter." Over the next 48 hours, I became a one-woman campaigner. I knocked on doors, handed out flyers, and posted digital petition links in community forums. Some neighbors smiled and signed immediately. Others locked their eyes on me as if I were a snake oil peddler. A few younger couples were enthusiastic, inspired by the Tribune article, but several retirees muttered about standing for tradition. I respected their opinions, but tradition had become a tool for silencing personal expression, and I refused to concede. Every evening, I returned home with my tote, heavier, brimming with printed names and scrawled notes. I'd plop onto the couch, run my hands through my hair, and stare at the succulent cutting, which seemed to nod encouragement back at me. Midday on Sunday, I received an unexpected text from Linda Carter. "Good afternoon, Ms. Harris. Please be advised that the board will hold an impromptu review session tomorrow at 10 a.m. to deliberate on your petition. You may attend if you wish." Impromptu. That sounded like an ambush. I forwarded the message to Marcus, who replied, "Likely an attempt to catch you unprepared. I'll call you in 10. His calm voice over the phone steadied me. "You need to request a postponement in writing," he advised. "Cite insufficient notice. Then we'll aim for the originally scheduled meeting 2 weeks from now." I drafted the postponement request on my laptop, citing HOA bylaws that mandated at least 7 days' notice before a meeting. I hit send at 6 p.m., heart pounding at the prospect of legal footwork. The succulent cutting sat beside my keyboard, its roots ticking forward like a clock. I whispered, "Just a little longer." Monday morning arrived gray and humid. Dew clung to the grass like ghostly jewels. I drove to the clubhouse again, binder in hand, heart braced for confrontation. At the glass doors, I found a new notice pinned to the bulletin board: special board review session today at 10 a.m. Agenda petition 2025-06. Under it, another note: all residents welcome. The tone was abrupt but polite. I stepped inside, scanning faces. Several supporters from the weekend appeared, clutching clipboards. Even the old man who'd grumbled in my first petition drive was there, arm in arm with his wife. A flutter of gratitude warmed my chest. I wasn't alone in this. We assembled in the meeting room, the board seated at the front, faces inscrutable. Linda called the meeting to order, her gavel lighter tonight, as though uncertain. Robert Klein read the postponement request aloud. Linda's lips formed a thin line. The board acknowledges receipt, she said carefully. However, we deem the request invalid, as the notice posted on the door constitutes official notice per section 4.2. The room shifted, shocked murmurings rose from neighbors. I suppressed a sigh. I'd expected pushback, but hearing it felt like a blow. I rose, meeting Linda's gaze. Section 4.2 also states notice must be posted both online and in writing to all parcels. This was only on the clubhouse door. I handed her a printed HOA digital policy. A commissure of doubt flickered across her face, and for a moment I felt triumph surge. That was my moment, my chance to prove that rules existed to be followed fairly. But then Robert Klein spoke, voice low. Even if notice was technically insufficient, the board will proceed tonight to avoid further delay. My heart sank as I realized they were invoking procedural loopholes to steamroll me. The board's deliberations began discussion of procedural fairness, the community's harmony, the growing unrest sparked by media coverage. Emma sat in the back, arms crossed, smirking as she took notes on her phone. My parents watched anxiously, their eyes shifting between me and the board. I gripped my binder, fingers whitening, and glanced at the succulent cutting on the table. It bobbed slightly, roots caught in the jar. I drew strength from it, fragile yet persevering. When it came time for me to speak, I stood swallowing. I respect this board's desire to resolve matters swiftly, I said, voice echoing in the hushed room. But fairness must be the cornerstone of our community. If we let exceptions erode due process, we sacrifice the very unity we claim to protect. I urge you to honor the bylaws, postpone this session, and allow adequate time for all voices to be heard. A few neighbors nodded, but the board members exchanged glances. Linda looked weary, then resolute. Ms. Harris, the vote is 8-2 in favor of proceeding. We will now vote on your petition. She called for a show of hands. I watched as only 5 hands rose, far short of the 1/3 requirement. A collective sigh of disappointment swept the viewers. I felt a cold wash of defeat, but I masked it. Thank you, I said quietly, stepping back to let the board proceed. As they tallied votes, I heard an unfamiliar rumble, the scrape of chairs as neighbors moved forward. To my astonishment, 15 supporters filed down the aisle, each clutching a signature sheet. They held them high, faces determined. We were not notified, protested one man. We're here now, another neighbor cried. You can't vote without our signatures. A murmur of agreement rose. Linda's eyes widened. Marcus, seated among supporters, stood and said calmly, the bylaws allow petitions to be submitted at any time before a vote is finalized. Over her protests, he cited Section 5.4, community petitions may be filed up to the commencement of the vote. The room erupted into debate. Board members whispered heatedly. Neighbors chimed in. Emma's face went pale. My parents looked at me, mouths agape. In that chaos, I felt a surge of vindication. My allies had risked their quiet lives for me. Linda pounded her gavel, trying to restore order. Fine, she said reluctantly. We'll accept these signatures and delay the vote until our scheduled session next week. Approval and cheers echoed through the room, some hearty, others polite. I felt tears prick my eyes as neighbors patted my back and murmured congratulations. I collected my binder, scooped up the succulent cutting, and made for the door. Just before I stepped out, I paused and looked back at Emma, who sat alone now, her phone abandoned in her lap. I offered a small nod, no warmth, no malice, just recognition that we had reached a turning point. Outside, the night air felt cooler, sweeter. I exhaled, shoulders falling for the first time in days. My phone buzzed with notifications, friends tagging me in congratulatory messages, the Tribune updating the article with neighbors bolster homeowners petition. I tapped the succulent cuttings jar idly, watching the roots swirl in their glass prison. I whispered, "We did it." And then I whispered, "But this is just the beginning." Because the next battle loomed, the official session next week, when rules would be examined under fresh scrutiny and perhaps other nails would be hammered in my coffin. Or maybe, just maybe, this community would finally see beyond covenants and complaint forms to the human heart behind the potted plant. I climbed into my car, leaned back in the seat, and closed my eyes. The succulent cutting sat beside me on the passenger seat, its tiny roots glimmering like streetlights against the glass. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel in a quiet rhythm, thinking of all the weight I'd carried here: family expectations, bureaucratic inertia, public scrutiny. And yet, here I was, still standing, still fighting. Tomorrow, I'd need to revisit my legal team, bolster my media narrative, perhaps even seek allyship with nearby communities facing similar petty tyranny. But for now, I let the night wash over me, my thoughts drifting between exhaustion and exhilaration. As I drove away from the clubhouse, the street lamps flickered overhead like sentinels, guiding me home. I glanced at the succulent cutting, its slender roots dancing with possibility. I whispered, "Hold tight," and realized that sometimes the smallest gestures, a 19th signature, a tiny plant cutting, could catalyze the largest transformations. But the path ahead was uncharted, and the winds of resistance still howled. I tapped my phone's screen and drafted a quick message to Marcus. "Thanks to everyone. Next session, next Tuesday, 7 p.m. Then in my mind, I rehearsed the words I'd say. I stand for fair process, personal expression, and the simple right to nurture what we love. I eased onto the main road toward home, headlights cutting through the night. In the rearview mirror, the clubhouse shrank until it was just another lit window in a row of houses. I thought of my grandmother, who taught me to care for every sprout, no matter how imperiled, and I felt her presence cradle me. I reached over and touched the succulent's jar, grateful for its quiet wisdom, that growth could be coaxed from brokenness, and that sometimes standing firm on small things opened the door to bigger freedoms. But as the miles ticked by, a flicker of doubt crawled back in Emma's smirk. Linda's steely gavel, the rumble of discontent still buzzing under the surface. The next Tuesday session would be the real test of whether a single homeowner could bend a system entrenched in tradition and inertia. I squeezed the succulent's jar gently and whispered, "Tomorrow we root deeper." And in that moment, I understood courage wasn't a one-time blaze. It was a relentless drip of conviction that over time could carve canyons through the hardest stone. Tomorrow, the drip would continue, and the question was whether the stone would finally give way. I woke before dawn again, the sky barely glimmering as I padded across the hardwood floor to check on my little succulent in its new terracotta home. Its leaves had unfurled overnight, a quiet celebration of roots, finally set in soil rather than water, and I bent to whisper, "You made it." I felt a swell of pride. Here was proof that a fragile thing could survive transitions and take hold in unfamiliar ground. I poured a small cup of water at its base, and as the damp soil sighed, I reminded myself today was the final HOA session, the one where I either secured my right to decorate my own porch or watched it slip through bureaucratic loopholes and petty grudges. I dressed in the same navy blazer and jeans, my uniform of defiance and professionalism slipped the succulent's original leaf from my pocket. That brittle fragment now hardened like a talisman into my handbag and headed to the clubhouse with my binder under one arm, heart thrumming. When I walked in, the room was packed tighter than before. Neighbors lining the walls. A small camera crew from a local TV station in the corner. And most unnerving, Emma perched with her arms folded, eyes glittering like a shark's. I felt the air shift as murmurs spread. "She's going live. Look at that guy holding the mic. I hope they let her speak." I placed my binder and the potted succulent on the podium table angled so the camera would catch its vibrant green against the uniform rows of gray folding chairs. President Linda Carter rapped the gavel seconds before 7 p.m., her posture stiffer than ever. I cleared my throat and began without preamble. Good evening, members of the Elmwood Estates HOA neighbors and viewers at home. My name is Chloe Harris, homeowner at 1426 Elmwood Drive. Tonight, I stand not just for myself, but for the principle that our homes, our sanctuaries, are ours to nurture as we choose. I let that sink in, then continued. I'm here to request the board finally adopt a reasonable amendment that existing exterior fixtures like the vintage bench and my ceramic planter be grandfathered in, so long as they pose no hazard. I've gathered over 40% of homeowners' signatures, exceeding by a healthy margin the 1/3 requirement. And I have documented evidence from 12 neighbors who've never been troubled until my conflict with my sister infiltrated our community. Linda adjusted her notes, her gaze flicking to the succulent. "Ms. Harris," she said, tone-clipped, "we have verified your petition signatures. However, the board must first address the complaints lodged by Ms. Emma Davis regarding sidewalk obstruction and by another resident identity withheld regarding aesthetic inconsistency." The camera zoomed in on Emma, who smirked triumphantly. I felt a flash of anger, but I steadied my breath and said, "Let's address the obstruction complaint first." I clicked my tablet, summoning a photo series the sidewalk at 1426 Elmwood, taken on 5 separate days by a neighbor's security camera. My bench sat flush against the porch, leaving a clear path. I held up a tablet screenshot. No one had tripped or even sidled awkwardly past. Obstruction. This bench has never impeded pedestrian traffic. It's 2 feet from the curb, meets all clearance guidelines, and on 3 of those days, a mail carrier paused beside it to deliver packages. A subtle cheer rose in the back. Emma's face grew pale. Her puppet strings, her mother's loyalty, her own entitlement were unraveling in real time. Next, Linda gestured to the aesthetic complaint. "About the ceramics," she said. "It's been noted that many older homes, such as 1402 and 1434, display similar planters. Why enforce rules now?" My moment. Because this is the first time it's a personal vendetta, not community concern. I've shown photographic proof of identical fixtures on adjacent properties. If we let one grudge set precedent, we undermine fairness. A hush fell. Then Robert Klein, normally rigid, stood and said, "I've reviewed the minutes, no prior complaints in the last 5 years. This dispute began the day the police were called." He paused, eyes on Emma. "I move that both complaints be dismissed and the board vote on the amendment as outlined." Heart pounding, I watched Linda's face flicker duty ward with decorum. She tapped her gavel. All those in favor of dismissing the complaints and adopting the amendment signify by raised hand. Nearly every hand shot up, at least 32 of 35 homeowners present. The board exchanged uncomfortable glances. Emma's slumped. My parents, seated off to the side, looked stunned but relieved. I allowed a small private smile. Linda cleared her throat. "The motion passes. Congratulations." A ripple of applause broke out, camera flashes popping. I felt tears sting my eyes, tears of triumph and exhaustion. I stepped forward and carefully repotted the succulent cutting into the same ceramic planter that had caused the fuss, patting the soil gently around its roots. We grow best where we're planted, I said softly enough for the mic to catch. As the crowd dispersed, neighbors came up to shake my hand, some with tears in their eyes, some with hearty backslaps. The local reporter approached her recorder off. "Chloe, is this the end?" she asked. I paused, looking at the succulent now settled in its rightful pot leaves glinting under the clubhouse lights. "It's a beginning," I told her. "There are still bylaws to amend, broader conversations about what community means. Rules should reflect people, not punish them. But tonight, we won a victory for personal expression." I lifted the pot so she could film the leaves. That night, I drove home on Elmwood Drive with the planter safely on the passenger seat. I felt lightheaded, elated, like I'd climbed a mountain and looked back at every fearful step. But as I pulled into my driveway and reached to unlatch the passenger door, my heart lurched. The planter sat cocked at a terrible angle, dirt smeared across the seat and floor mat. One leaf was missing, ripped clean from the stalk, and a note scrawled on scrap paper lay atop the soil. "Enjoy your victory. Don't get too comfortable." My fingers trembled as I picked up the note, the succulent's fresh soil crumbling through my palm. My victory felt suddenly precarious, as though someone had reminded me that the price of standing up could be intimidation or worse. I flicked on the porch light. The street was silent, the other houses dark. I knelt beside the planter, gently searched the spilled dirt for the missing leaf, but it was gone. I felt a hollow ache, a sting of betrayal, a question of how far they would go. I cradled the pot and stepped onto the porch, the night air cool against my face, smelling faintly of rain to come. I whispered to the remaining leaves, "We're still here. We'll rebuild." I carried the planter inside, set it on its pedestal by the door, and stood back, noticing for the first time how alone I felt in that moment. My phone buzzed, texts from neighbors, celebrating emails from Marcus, confirming next steps, a DM from Jordan, asking for comment on tonight's sabotage. I slid down to the floor by the succulent, wrapped my arms around my knees, and let the adrenaline drain. I reminded myself of the cutting's delicate roots in the new soil. If it could survive uprooting, so could I. But I also knew this was no longer just about an HOA or a plant. It was about what happens when entitlement meets powerlessness, when regulations become weapons, and when personal boundaries are trampled. Tomorrow, I would call the police again, file a report for vandalism, and likely hear Emma's denial ringing in my ears. I would message Marcus about adding a harassment clause to my cease and desist, and I would need to brace for the storm that follows any small victory that rattles entrenched egos. But in the silence, as I turned the pot gently in my hands and examined each remaining leaf for damage, I felt a fierce calm return. I had built too much to let one act of cowardice from my own sister or from whoever lurked in the dark undermine it. I whispered more to myself than the plant. "Let's see how far you can grow now." And as the night settled, I realized that this moment, trembling on the edge between triumph and sabotage, was exactly where the real test began. Because standing your ground isn't enough. You have to keep standing long after the applause fades and the lights go out. And I was determined to stand. Tomorrow, I'd take my stand again, this time against whoever thought they could scare me back into the shadows. But for now, I let the weight of the planter rest on my lap, the hint of rain pattering against the window. And I let myself feel both weary and alive, ready for whatever came next. I woke before dawn again, the sky barely lightening as I crept across my cottage's hardwood floors, my heart still hammering from last night's discovery. The once pristine ceramic planter lay on its side by the front door, soil caked into the grain of the wood, and one of my succulent's proudest leaves was gone, snapped clean off like a promise, broken. I knelt and gingerly scooped it up, brushing the dirt away, but the jagged edge was unmistakable, deliberate sabotage. I breathed in and out, reminding myself that panic would only concede victory to whoever did this. I dialed 911 on my burner phone, reported the vandalism, and then called Marcus, my lawyer, to add this new act of harassment to the cease and desist. he said quietly. "We'll file for a protective order if this continues. Let me know every time something happens." I hung up, gathered the remaining leaves of my succulent and its cutting now growing true roots in fresh soil, and carried them inside like sacred relics. I spent most of that morning scrubbing the porch tiles, replanting the cutting back into its original pot, and installing 3 motion sensor cameras, one facing the driveway, one on the back door, and one trained on the planter itself. Each time I clicked a cable into place, I felt a rush of empowerment. No longer would I cower behind locked doors. I rewired my smart home system so that alerts pinged directly to my phone and to a cloud-based storage that even my family couldn't override. Then I brewed a strong cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the succulent cutting gleaming in its pot next to my laptop, and opened the HOA's public records portal. The board minutes went back years: garden club fundraisers, holiday light rules, pool maintenance schedules. I scrolled until I found the September meeting where Emma's complaint first appeared. Then I saw a brief mention of a concern from one Linda Carter, the HOA president, about aesthetic uniformity. Next month's minutes showed a motion also by Linda to tighten the covenant on acceptable planters. My blood ran cold. This was bigger than petty sibling rivalry. It was an orchestrated campaign to force me out or force me to conform. I copied every line and screenshot, then forwarded the dossier to Jordan Lee, the Chicago Tribune reporter, with a note: "Found evidence linking Linda Carter's motion directly to Emma's complaint. She's weaponizing her position." Jordan replied almost instantly, "I'll look into Carter's background. Stay tuned." By late afternoon, the neighborhood chatter had shifted from polite sympathy to outrage. Half a dozen neighbors texted me to say they'd seen someone lurking by my porch late last night, that they'd backed up my bracket of motion sensor footage, that they were willing to testify. A retired schoolteacher down the block even offered to read into the record her own petition calling for Linda's removal, citing conflict of interest statutes. My stomach did a little flip. For the first time, I felt the full weight of collective support. I realized that my fight had become emblematic of a larger struggle: the right to personalize our homes, to stand up to entrenched power, and to demand accountability from those who govern us. That evening, I prepared my remarks for the next HOA meeting, an extra session Linda had hastily scheduled, probably to bury her own tracks before I could make them public. I practiced in front of the succulent, running through data points: number of petition signatures, percentage of homeowners opposed to the new planter restrictions, camera timestamps of suspicious activity. I imagined the gasps when I revealed the board minutes tying Linda's motion directly to Emma's complaint. But I also rehearsed a softer pitch: how a community should be a place where individuals add character and warmth, not a cookie-cutter strip mall where every porch looks like the next. I knew that confrontation alone could feel like attacking the very idea of community, so I planned to frame my argument as a call for renewal, a chance to modernize the covenants to reflect diverse tastes and lifestyles. On the day of the meeting, I sat in my car 5 minutes early, my binder and my succulent securely stashed on the passenger seat. I reviewed the security footage on my phone: a dark figure hood up reaching for the planter at 2:17 a.m. I hit export and sent the clip to Marcus, asking him to prepare a harassment injunction that would compel the HOA to investigate the incident. Then I walked into the clubhouse, greeted by a sea of familiar faces, some anxious, some resolute. Jordan Lee was there with her camera crew, and behind her stood Linda Carter, stiff and pale, flanked by a few board members who avoided looking me in the eye. Emma sat next to Mom and Dad, her posture rigid. I felt a tingle of triumph. I had them on the ropes. Linda opened the meeting with her usual formality, but her voice wavered. "We're here to address the latest complaints and to consider Ms. Harris's petition for amendment." She tapped her papers nervously. I stood, moved to the podium, and gestured to my succulent perched on a small side table. "Good evening," I said, voice clear, carrying through the room. "I'd like to begin by sharing evidence of a targeted act of vandalism against my property." I played the clip: the hooded figure, the reach, the undeniable force that snapped the leaf. Gasps echoed as the video rolled. Emma's face went pale. Her father covered his mouth. I kept going. This was not a random act. It occurred the night after Linda Carter's new motion to restrict planters was introduced. I asked the board, will we protect the rights of one homeowner, or will we enable covert intimidation? A hand shot up in the back, Robert Klein rising to his feet. The footage is compelling, he said. Linda Carter, did you authorize an investigation into Ms. Harris's planter policy? She twisted a pen between her fingers. I sought consistency only, she replied. I had no hand in this, vandalism. I nodded and turned to the board. If we cannot protect homeowners from private aggression spurred by HOA directives, we lose the moral authority to enforce any rule. I propose an immediate moratorium on all aesthetic complaints, an independent inquiry into the September motion, and a vote to rescind the planter restrictions. The room crackled with tension. Some neighbors whispered support, others pivoted uncomfortably. Then Emma stood, cheeks flushed. You're turning this into a spectacle, she accused. We're all tired of this drama. I met her gaze, my voice firm but calm. Drama begins when power is unchecked. This is not about me. It's about every person who wants to call Elmwood Estates home without fear of harassment. The silence that followed felt sacred. Then Robert called the measure to a vote. 32 hands shot up in favor of the moratorium and inquiry. Only 3, Linda, Emma, and 1 other board member remained seated. As Linda pounded her gavel trying to object, there was a roar of applause that rose above her protests. Jordan Lee's camera flashed wildly. Neighbors crowded around me, shaking my hand, thanking me for speaking truth to power. I felt a wave of lightness crash through my chest, relief, vindication, hope. I knelt and held the succulent's pot to the crowd. This plant will live, I said, voice thick. And so will our community if we stand together. I walked out into the cool night air, my supporters trailing behind me. My phone buzzed with messages from local news outlets wanting updates from neighbors offering to help clean up my porch, from Marcus reminding me to follow up on the injunction. I paused under the street lamp, looked back at the clubhouse windows bright with celebration, and realized how far I'd come from a frightened woman barricaded in her own home to someone who had rallied an entire neighborhood to defend justice and individuality. But as the wind kicked up and the autumn leaves skittered across the pavement, I felt the tug of something unresolved, a flicker of anxiety that refused to extinguish. Change had been won, but at what cost? My family was fractured beyond repair. The HOA's leadership had been publicly shamed, and now my life had become a local cause célèbre. I wondered if exposure would eventually backfire, if the same attention that empowered me today might turn into a spotlight that burned too hot to withstand. I carried the succulent cutting in its ceramic pot up my porch steps, set it on its pedestal by the door, and reached out to touch a fresh sprout barely a quarter-inch tall. As my finger brushed its tip, a single leaf trembled, a quiet, perfect echo of every heartbeat that had brought me here. I paused, closing my eyes, and let the moment settle. Victory tinged with uncertainty, triumph laced with vulnerability. I set the plant inside, flicked off the porch light, and stepped back into the darkened cottage. Inside, the glow of my smart home panel showed live feeds from each camera. The planter stood undisturbed, its leaves glossy and unbowed. I swiped through the footage one more time, half expecting another shadow to slip across the frame. But it was calm, peaceful, almost. I poured myself a glass of wine and sank onto the couch, feet propped up, eyes drifting to the succulent across the room. My phone buzzed again, an email from Jordan with the subject line, "Front page, tomorrow." I tapped it open. "Congratulations. This story is going national. Be ready for calls from network news." My heart skipped. National exposure. That might mean spotlight on my career at Capwave, colleagues gossiping my personal life boiled down to sound bites. I hesitated, then deleted the email. I wasn't done choosing my story. I leaned forward, adjusted the succulent so its leaves caught the soft lamp glow, and whispered, "We decide how we grow." And in the hush of my living room, surrounded by the evidence of every risk I'd taken and every boundary I'd drawn, I felt an unbreakable bond with that tiny plant, fragile, yes, but fiercely determined to thrive, no matter how many storms came. I reached out and patted the pot's edge, then stood and walked to the window. Beyond the glass Elmwood Drive lay quiet, each porch dark except for mine. I pressed my hand to the pane, looking for the future in the faint reflections of streetlights. The night was still, but it felt ripe with possibility and a promise of new challenges I'd be ready to meet. I blew out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding and turned away, knowing that when the morning came, I'd rise again and water my succulent, ready to grow on my own terms, come what may.